The air did not simply grow still, it vanished. This was the Oklahoma Territory in May of 1893. While many people speak of a tornado's roar, the freight train clamor written about in newspapers, the initial sign is not a noise. It is a sensation deep in your ears, akin to being submerged in water. The atmospheric pressure plummets so rapidly that cattle collapse in the fields as their inner equilibrium gives way. As his neighbors gathered on their porches to gaze at the green-tinged sky, Silas Rump was positioned behind a bulwark of soil. A substantial berm of red clay was piled 4 feet high against the stone foundation of his barn. He wasn't watching the clouds. His attention was on the joints of a wall that appeared to emerge organically from the hillside. In 20 minutes, the entire valley would be obliterated. To grasp why he was standing in what looked like a pit, one must first understand why everyone else was erecting towers. This period followed directly after the land run, a time of free earth. If a person could stake a claim, they could possess it. Such a promise drove men to act with haste. They constructed their buildings quickly, inexpensively, and with square dimensions. The conventional barn throughout the territory was a balloon frame. It was a modern building method at the time. Long, lightweight 2x4s fastened together, a skin stretched over a skeletal frame. The process was swift. A barn could be raised in a single week by 3 men with a keg of nails. The results looked impressive, with tall, flat walls standing defiantly against the horizon. Yet out on these plains, the wind perceives a flat wall as a sail and treats a vertical surface as a direct challenge. When a gale strikes the broad, flat side of a barn, it finds nowhere to go and simply pushes. If that wall refuses to yield, the wind then attacks the corners, which are the structure's weakest point. A square corner effectively traps the wind. Pressure accumulates within that 90-degree angle until the nails can no longer secure the wood. It is a matter of basic leverage. The wind forces the wall inward. The roof is lifted upward, and the entire building collapses like a structure made of playing cards. Silas Rump perceived this vulnerability. He was not a farmer by profession, but a man who was a keen observer of his surroundings. He had watched how water navigated around a stone in a creek, not by fighting the obstacle, but by splitting and flowing around it. He would look upon the square barns rising across the county and simply shake his head. He did not reach for a hammer to begin his work. Instead, he took up a shovel. He dedicated 3 months to moving soil. While other men were applying fresh paint to their siding, Silas was banking clay against his stone walls, effectively burying the lower half of his building. The neighbors took notice. In a small community, acting differently is often perceived as being incorrect. They nicknamed him the Mole. They would ride past in their wagons, gesturing at the earthworks. "Looks like Silas is digging a grave for his cows," they would comment. "Those timbers will rot through in the first good rain." The reasoning of his neighbors was entirely vertical. One built upward to declare ownership of the land, and constructed tall structures to store hay. A low barn appeared impoverished and timid. But Silas was not building to display pride. He was building for the day the sky turned an unnatural green. He banked the earth to a height of 4 feet, wanting the foundation of his barn to be the land itself. The wind is incapable of blowing down a hill. By berming the foundation, he eliminated the bottom 4 feet of wind resistance, ensuring the air would strike the slope and glide over the lower walls. The digging, however, was only the beginning. The true affront to the local builders was the structure's shape. When Silas laid out his foundation, he did not drive 4 stakes to mark 4 corners. He drove 8. He was deliberately cutting the corners off. This prompted even louder laughter from the neighbors. An octagonal barn? How could one stack hay in a circle or park a square wagon in a round space? It seemed inefficient and was certainly more difficult to construct, requiring more mathematical calculation than most men possessed. But Silas understood that the wind is fundamentally lazy, always seeking the path of least resistance. A square corner represents an argument with the wind, whereas an octagon is more like a conversation. By angling the walls, he guaranteed that the wind could never strike the building head-on. It would always be a glancing impact, sliding off the sides instead of punching straight through them. His neighbors saw a waste of valuable time. Silas saw a hole capable of navigating a storm. He continued to dig until he reached the hardpan layer of soil, while the square barns all around him stood waiting for the gust that would bring them down. Silas Rump was not a farmer by his original trade. Before he staked his claim in the red soil, he had dedicated 15 years of his life to the rivers. He had been a shipwright's apprentice long before he became a cattleman. He comprehended something a sodbuster had no need to know: the sheer power of a fluid moving against a solid mass. On the river, you learn quickly that you cannot halt the water. If you build a flat wall against the Mississippi's current, the river will eventually dismantle it. The issue is not one of strength, but of shape. You must allow the water to proceed where it intends to go. Silas viewed the wind in the same manner he viewed the river. It was a fluid too thin to be seen, but the physics were identical. When wind collides with a structure, it generates drag. If that structure is a box, the drag transforms into force, thousands of pounds of pressure pushing against the nails. But if the structure is shaped like a hull, the fluid glides past. This was the fundamental logic behind the Octagon. It was not a matter of style, but of raw hydrodynamics, applied to the violent atmosphere of the plains. He commenced his work with the earth itself. The neighbors were building upward, setting their sills directly upon the grass. Silas, in contrast, spent his first month moving soil. He did not merely dig, he constructed a berm, banking the red clay 4 feet up against his masonry. This was excruciatingly hard labor. Oklahoma clay is dense, heavy, and notoriously sticky. Lacking a team of mules, he had only a shovel and a wheelbarrow. He moved tons of earth by hand, insulating the floor of his future barn below the frost line, and packing the clay until it was as solid as hardpan. The neighbors dubbed it Silas's bunker. They would halt their wagons to observe him as he packed the heavy slopes. "Hey Silas," one might shout, "are you preparing for a war?" They could not fathom why a man would willingly work so hard to bury his own building. They speculated he was constructing a dam, and predicted the damp earth would rot his timbers and rust his tools. But Silas was not building a reservoir. He was lowering the structure's center of gravity. A standard barn is top-heavy, a kite awaiting a strong wind. By berming the foundation, Silas made certain the wind could not gain leverage. The first 4 feet of any storm would pass harmlessly over the earthen bank. The wind cannot knock over what it cannot strike. It was a simple principle of leverage. There was an additional advantage. The earth maintains a constant temperature. While the air temperature fluctuated from over 100 degrees to 10 below zero, the thermal mass of the stone in the earthen bank remained stable. By berming his barn, Silas was creating a natural temperature regulator. In the depths of winter, as his neighbors' barns froze solid, his design would stay up to 75 degrees warmer than the outside air, radiating stored heat back into the interior. His neighbors were building freezers. Silas was building a thermal battery. He shaped the excavated area into an octagon, an expression of the shipwright's intuition. Consider a river stone. A square rock in a swift current will be tumbled and tossed, but a rounded stone remains in place because the water flows around it. The octagon is essentially a circle composed of straight lines. Regardless of the wind's direction, be it from the north, south, or the twisting vortex of a cyclone, it would never encounter a flat wall. It would always deliver a glancing blow, deflecting the wind rather than blocking it. While the town chuckled at the mole man, Silas was meticulously laying the keel of his vessel. He lined the bottom with gravel to ensure proper drainage, addressing the water problem from the start. He then built walls of stone 18 inches thick. He was not merely constructing a shelter, he was building a hull designed to endure a hurricane. The neighbors saw a foolish endeavor. Silas saw the only safe harbor in a sea of grass that was about to become exceedingly violent. He wiped the dirt from his hands. The walls constituted only half of the battle. If you were to ask any builder in the tornado belt where a barn typically fails first, they would not point to the foundation, but to the eaves. The roof is the most perilous part of the structure because it functions like a wing. When a 60-mile-an-hour wind rushes over a standard gable roof, it decreases the air pressure on top. The air inside the barn, still at normal pressure, pushes upward, seeking to explode the roof off the walls. Silas understood that a strong hole was meaningless if the hatch blew open. He needed a lid that would refuse to lift. Most men in the territory framed a roof like a house of cards, with 2 rafters leaning against each other, connected by a ridge beam and a few nails. If the walls spread by even an inch, the roof would collapse. If the wind got beneath the overhang, the roof would detach. Silas disregarded the standard A-frame design and returned to the geometry of the wheel. He began by constructing a continuous plate along the top of his stone walls. He took thin strips of green oak, soaked them in the creek until they were pliable, and then bent them into a curve, laminating them together to form a single, solid ring of timber. This was a technique taken directly from the shipyard. Soaked and bent oak strips creating a tension ring that no carpenter in the county had ever witnessed. This was not just a surface for nailing rafters. It was a belt that tied all 8 walls together, preventing them from spreading and turning the top of the barn into a rigid hoop. Next came the rafters, and this was the part that made the neighbors stop their wagons and simply stare. There was no central pole. In a round barn, a center pole is a major inconvenience, obstructing the use of a hay fork and getting in the way of a wagon. Silas desired a clear span of 40 feet with nothing but air in the middle. To achieve this, he built a compression ring, a heavy wooden hub that would float 20 feet in the air. He cut the rafters on the ground, not just butting them together, but notching them with a shipwright's joint, where the tongue of one timber fits snugly into the groove of another. He hoisted the central hub into the air on a temporary scaffold and began to slot the rafters into place, one by one, like the spokes of a wagon wheel. When the final rafter was hammered home and the scaffold was knocked away, the roof did not sag. It settled. The weight of the roof pushed inward toward the central hub. The very gravity that pulls a normal roof down actually made Silas's roof stronger. The heavier the load, whether from snow, shingles, or the sheer weight of the timber, the tighter the joints locked together. It was a structure held intact by its own tendency to fall. The shape itself provided the final defense. A standard roof presents 2 flat faces that catch the wind like sails. Silas's roof, however, had 8 triangular sections sloping up to a single point, forming a cone made of facets. When the wind hit it, the air was compelled to split, unable to grab a flat surface to generate lift. The pitch was steep enough to shed the heavy spring rains, but shallow enough for the wind to slide over it smoothly. It was aerodynamic long before that word was used in farming. There was a quiet efficiency to the design as well. By trimming the corners off a square, Silas had enclosed more floor space using less lumber. A square barn with a 40-foot perimeter covers a specific area of ground, but an octagon with the same perimeter covers 20% more. He was gaining free space simply by altering the geometry. He sheathed the roof in cedar shakes, nailing them down in overlapping scales. When he was done, the barn did not look like a typical building. It resembled a mushroom cap, low, dark, and deeply rooted. It was completed on a Tuesday. The sky turned a distinctively ugly color on Thursday. The test was imminent. It was 2 o'clock when the birds fell silent, always the first sign in the territory. The heat had been intensifying since dawn, a moist, heavy blanket that made the air difficult to breathe. Then the color shifted. The sky did not turn gray, but the shade of a bruised plum, which then morphed into a sickly, illuminated green. It is a color that seems unnatural, the color of hail and impending violence. Silas Rump stood by his gate and watched the horizon dissolve. It wasn't a funnel at first, but a solid wall, a churning curtain of debris 2 miles wide, consuming the landscape. It advanced with a terrifying, grinding slowness, erasing the world one fence post at a time. The sound arrived long before the wind, not as a whistle, but as a vibration that rattled the teeth in one's jaw, a low-frequency hum that escalated into the sound of 1,000 locomotives dragging steel chains across the earth. Down the valley, his neighbors were scrambling, throwing children into root cellars and slamming heavy wooden doors. They left their pride and joy, those tall, square, white-painted barns, standing exposed in the pastures. These structures were sitting ducks, rigid, upright, and flat-faced. They had been built to shed rain, not to confront a monster, designed for calm days and gentle breezes, utterly unprepared for the violence arriving from the west. As the storm's leading edge struck the McPherson farm a mile to the east, the physics of the square corner finally came due. Silas watched, or rather heard, the destruction. When a 100-mile-an-hour wind hits a flat wall, That wall acts like a sail, catching every ounce of force. The pressure inside the McPherson barn spiked instantly. The nails in the corner posts shrieked, the specific sound of a square barn dying, the high-pitched scream of iron being ripped from dry oak. The walls bowed inward, the roof lifted like a hat, and then the entire structure simply exploded. It didn't just fall, it disintegrated, becoming a cloud of splinters that joined the debris field, turning into ammunition for the wind to use against the next farm. Then the wall of wind hit the Octagon. It arrived with the force of a battering ram, striking the north face of Silas's barn. But here, the physics were different. There was no flat wall to absorb the full brunt of the impact. The wind hit the angled face and was forced to split, flowing around the structure like water around a bridge piling. The air screamed as it accelerated around the curves, but could find no purchase, sliding past the cedar siding without biting into the wood. It could not find a corner to use as leverage. The barn did not stand rigid. It shuddered. The heavy timber frame groaned as the compression ring in the roof locked even tighter. The harder the wind pushed, the more the joints compressed, the structure using the storm's own energy to hold itself together. Inside, the pressure dropped so low that your ears would have popped painfully as the barn experienced a vacuum. In a normal building, this is when windows shatter inward. But Silas had left the hay doors on the leeward side unlatched. They flew open, allowing the barn to breathe. The hull held. The shingles were stripped from the roof like scales from a fish, vanishing into the darkness, but the skeleton, the heavy, sunken octagonal bones, did not move an inch. The earth berm deflected the heavy debris that would have punched holes in an exposed wall. The roar lasted 4 minutes. The silence that followed felt like a lifetime. When the sun finally broke through the bruised clouds, it did not illuminate a farm, but a vast debris field. The valley floor appeared as if it had been scoured with a wire brush. The McPherson place, the fences, the windmills, all were erased. The air smelled of wet earth and the sharp, turpentine scent of shattered pine. The silence was heavier than the wind had been. Typically, after a storm, you hear the lowing of cattle or the barking of dogs, but the storm had taken the animals as well, at least those left in the open. The only sound was the dripping of water from the one roof that remained. Silas's barn looked battered. The cedar shakes were gone, stripped clean by the vacuum. The windward side was plastered with so much red mud and straw that it looked like stucco. Yet the ridgeline was perfectly straight, and the walls were plumb. The compression ring had not budged. It was the only vertical object left in a horizontal world. The neighbors climbed out of their root cellars into a landscape they no longer recognized. They walked through the wreckage of their own vertical ambitions, stepping over the splintered remains of their quickly built balloon frames. They walked toward the only thing left standing. This time, there was no laughter. They stood at the edge of the mud pit and stared. They saw where debris, fence posts, branches, and pieces of their own roofs had skidded harmlessly over the low, earth-sheltered walls. They saw how the wind had tried to lift the roof and failed, because the harder it pulled, the tighter the octagon had locked itself together. They understood in that moment. The wind had not spared Silas through sheer luck. It had spared him because he had refused to fight it. The earthen berm, the very feature they had mocked as a grave, had served as a shield. The octagonal shape had created a slipstream. It was a victory of geometry over brute force. The mockery had evaporated. In the weeks that followed, men came from the next county to examine the joinery. They measured the angles and inquired about the continuous plate. They studied the hull that had successfully sailed through the storm. But here lies the hard truth about survival. Being right does not always lead to being copied. You do not see octagonal barns everywhere today. They did not take over the plains. The reason is that they are difficult to build. Cutting a compound miter joint requires a master craftsman, not a hired hand. Stacking rectangular bales of hay in a round room is a logistical headache. It is inefficient for the machine, even if it is perfect for the wind. People return to building squares because squares are simple. They chose convenience over resilience, opting to rebuild every 20 years rather than build once to last forever. Silas was not concerned with trends. He only cared that his cattle were alive. He had proven that it was not magic, but simply physics applied to wood. Nature does not hold a vendetta against you. It merely operates by a set of rules. If you build with arrogance, nature will break you. If you build with an understanding of geometry, it will respect you. Silas's barn stood for another 80 years, outliving the men who had laughed at it, a testament to the enduring strength of the circle. If you wish to learn about more designs that worked in harmony with the land instead of against it, subscribe. The wind is always waiting.